I've just spent a very entertaining hour talking to the leaders of Rejoin EU, a political party that wants to rejoin the European Union, that wants to reverse Brexit. And I was speaking specifically to Brendan Donnelly, who's the new leader of Rejoin EU, and to Richard Hewison, who is the former leader of Rejoin EU. It's been going for about 4 years. It's a vibrant talking party. There are other parties that are interested in rejoining the EU, as we'll get to in the talk. Parties like the True and Fair Party of Gina Miller's, parties like Volt, and to a certain extent, even perhaps the mainstream of the Lib Dem party, though not its leader. And I was asking them, first of all, how they plan to promote themselves, and what happens when they are successful. What happens when Britain rejoins the EU? What happens to the Rejoin EU party and to its membership? So let's have a look at what we were discussing, and I hope you enjoy the wide-ranging chat.
That's me.
Brenda Donnelly, you're the person who's really in charge, and Richard, you're the person who was formerly in charge. Is that right?
We have a collective leadership. We have a collective leadership. We rotate things. It's a Soviet style decision making.
Yeah.
Yes,
I agree with the boss.
And I just called you the wrong party. I mentioned the word reform, which I'm not. You're Rejoin.
Do you know, so many people recently on Twitter have made exactly that mistake.
Yes.
I put out a tweet the other day, which was intended just to be a sort of light-hearted tweet. I got about 5 responses saying, isn't it funny someone from the Reform Party actually has a sense of humour? And I was, well, actually.
So look, let's begin. Let's put the cards on the table. What do you want to do? What does Rejoin intend to produce? Do you literally intend to rejoin the EU?
Absolutely. That's the name of the party. That's the name of the policy. Effectively, we started pretty much 4 years ago, originally as a vehicle to stand for the London mayoral elections in 2020, which then became 2021. Basically, to oppose what was happening at the time in terms of an uncontrolled Brexit with very little care or consideration for the impact. And we wanted to stand in London to provide a voice for those who wished to indicate that actually they did want to remain within the EU and they did want to rejoin after when we did actually have the election in 2021 after we'd just formally left. Now, 4 years later on, a number of people wanted us to continue, wanted us to provide that particular label for other elections. And so here we are in the 2024 election, still here and still hopefully providing that vehicle.
Well, you did surprisingly well in the London mayoral elections. It wasn't a disaster, but do you think too much time has now elapsed?
Well, that's a very good question. We did get we got a nice 5-figure number of votes in London, so it was quite clear there was a large number of people who agreed with us. I think a lot of people were just thinking, oh, well, we can't affect things, we can't do things, so we'll vote for other parties. One of the big questions in 2024 is where our vote will be now. Now, obviously, we stood down in the mayoral election this time because well, not only has the incumbent, Sadiq Khan, been very pro-EU, indeed, I think has annoyed Mr. Starmer quite deeply with some of the things he said in terms of the EU. The Green candidate, Zoe, has also been very, very positive about the EU. If we look back 4 years ago, the Greens, the Lib Dems and Labour were all taking a vow of silence on this. I'm still surprised how quiet the Lib Dems are in London on what should be their big policy, if I'm honest there. So because we've stood down from the mayoral election, we don't get a party election broadcast this time. And that, of course, is going to be a big, big drag on the publicity we can get. But we are still standing on the assembly list. We have a very simple proposition, 5% on the assembly list, which is PR. It doesn't split the vote. It doesn't prevent other progressive parties getting onto the London Assembly. 5% gets us a member on the Assembly, and if we get a member on the Assembly will be forced to discuss the issue of London re-engaging with Europe because we will put it on the agenda of the Assembly. So in a nutshell, that is our offer.
I
But
think we've got an advantage compared with last time as well, which is that public opinion has been moving very, very steadily, more quickly than I might have expected, in favour of rejoining. And
yes.
that in spite of the fact that there's not been any political party leadership in that direction. They've either been quiet about it or pretended that Brexit was a howling success. So it's a very significant development in British politics that people haven't moved on. People still understand, or are beginning even more to understand, that Brexit was a mistake. And we want to draw the logical conclusions from that, because we don't think that fiddling around at the edges with youth mobility, good idea as it is, it's a way of slightly limiting the damage of Brexit. But why go through 100 agonies of separate negotiations? We want to cut to the heart of the chase and say, let's rejoin.
What do you think of the Erasmus plans at the moment? Because we're getting little sort of hints towards a better relationship with Europe. Would that be a modest victory for you if we got more elements of a better relationship?
I'm not sure. I think you can argue it either way. I certainly don't think that spending an enormous amount of time and negotiating capital and bandwidth of political attention to get an arrangement that is, at the end of the day, much worse than the one we had before is necessarily the best way to get back into the European Union. I think it postpones things and postpones things in a way that could lead anywhere. If you want to get back into the European Union, I think the way of doing it is to get back into the European Union. It's not to do it by grandmother's steps. And I think there's a political danger there as well, because at the end of it, people can say, well, you never said that this was a route back to the European Union. You have to make the case transparently and honestly in favour of the European Union, rather than saying, well, there's this little bit of it we want, that little bit of it we might be able to put up with, and then this bit will follow in due course.
But you were quite you were quite central in the European Union yourself, weren't you, Brendan?
I was a member of the European Parliament. I don't know if that, and I was a Conservative member of the European Parliament.
Member.
I don't know how central that makes me.
How well do you get on with your former Conservative colleagues now?
Well, the people who I was a member with, it was a different word. To be honest, I don't have much contact, much social contact with former Conservatives, because in my view, and they know that I think this, they've in many cases sold out what I know to be their convictions, not very different to my own, in order to stay within the party. I think when a party goes right off the rails, like the Conservative Party has gone, there are always conflicts of loyalty, and different people have to resolve them in different ways. But I think the patience of some of my colleagues, or many of my colleagues, really has degenerated into complacency and perhaps even cowardice in some cases.
Yes, I find I've become I find I've lost all political party as a result.
Well, we have a home for you. We have a home for you.
I would be
This
very
is exactly why we set up the party in the first place. Many of us thought we just don't have anyone to vote for at the moment.
Well, my former sojourn into a smaller party was an attempt to see whether or not UKIP was actually racist, and I found that it genuinely was. So I blew a whistle. Well, you know, people can say something about a party, but unless you actually get into it, you can't really find out. And you don't know whether this is just people smearing a party, or whether it's true. And I actually found the evidence, so I blew the whistle. But
sometimes there's a difference between the leadership of a party and what the members of a party, and what the MPs, and then again the voters for the Labour Party, or whatever it is.
I found the members of the party I found the membership of UKIP was quite benign.
Yes.
But the administration was quite definitely hard right, I think is probably the polite term.
And we've got a similar disjunction, if you like, between the leadership of the Labour Party and most people who are active in the Labour Party.
Yes,
very much. And I would really urge people throughout the election to actually talk to the people that come around to your doorsteps, particularly the representatives from the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, and ask yourself, do these people believe in the same thing that they're actually selling to the party? And I think most people will conclude that largely they don't. And I think particularly in the Liberal Democrats, that is very, very parallel. I mean, last time we were out campaigning in a by-election where there was a large Liberal Democrat presence, Chesham and Amersham, a while ago back now, some of the Liberal Democrats were very angry with us. They came out and said, "Why are you standing? We're on your side. We want to rejoin." And we said, "Well, why does Ed Davies say you're not a rejoin party then?" They, "Oh, yes, we know Ed's a bit of a problem, but we're having words with him. We'll sort him out." Well, 3 years later, we still have the voice from the top contradicting what the membership wants to do. And particularly, I would say to Liberal Democrats coming up to the general election, please take a good look at your public image. Officially, you have a policy which is now supported by 2/3 of the country. You are currently on 9% in the opinion polls. And I had a conversation with a Liberal Democrat the other week who was basically saying, well, we can't get rid of Ed Davey now. Just think of the damage it would do. And my answer is, you're on 9%. It can't get much worse. Put someone useful there and fight a genuine election campaign, for goodness sake.
Well, 9% is less than Reform. And I have to say, all the main parties are talking about forging a better relationship with Europe. Even the Conservative Party is effectively doing that, but none are talking about leaving.
About rejoining, you mean?
About rejoining.
Yeah.
About leaving the present situation, rejoining Europe. And unless you have serious votes, do you think you're a party that's got enough pressure to effect change? So you're talking about putting pressure on the Lib Dems when they come round to the doorstep. That's one thing, but it's not going to change the leadership's view. You can put pressure on Labour in the same way.
I think that's a very good question, Tim. And I think it's circumstantial to a large extent. And what I would give you is the example of the current London elections. Now, let's imagine you were Sadiq Khan, and it's back in January. You're a bit nervous about Susan Hall talking about ULEZ and some of the things in the outer boroughs. All the opinion polls say you're safe, but you're kind of thinking, I'm not. So you look down the list of parties in the last election. Now, we came sixth out of the 18 parties in the last election with a large 5-figure number of votes in the Assembly election. And if you're looking at that as Sadiq Khan, you're saying, well, I know we're not going to get rid of the Conservatives, Greens or Lib Dems. The Women's Equality Party, who came fifth, they're not standing this time. So who do I speak to? And then a few weeks later, we get an incredibly pro-EU speech, which is clearly aimed at that sector of the voters. So I would say it's quite possible that those people who voted for us last time in London and on record put us at number 6 out of 18 parties have influenced the direction of travel in the debate of one of the major players. Now, obviously, I can't back that up with physical evidence, but it seems very suspicious to me. And obviously, our party responded to that by saying, well, you know what? If both Sadiq Khan and Zoe Garbutt are going to talk a lot about Europe, we don't need to be in the mayoral election. So yes, I do think it's quite possible that you can have influence as a small party when it comes to trying to push the direction of the debate.
That's what UKIP did. That's what UKIP did.
Oh, UKIP was very successful in doing that. Indeed, Farage, I would say, has defined politics for the last 10 years and probably for the next 10 years. So surely.
Well, in some ways, we regard ourselves as being a mirror image of UKIP, we're, as it were, snapping increasingly effectively, we hope, at the heels of the potential main parties who might change their view and come round to our sense of things. We're a party that, in the right set of circumstances, would consider its mission having been done.
But you lack the one thing that you lack the one thing that Farage had for so long, which was a place in the European Parliament and a voice on a regular basis to make these extraordinary speeches, to perfect his methodology and to perfect that message.
Yes, it's true. It's true that we lack the BBC, which not merely picked up the fact that he was in the European Parliament, but gave him a platform like it gave no other MEP. At Question Time, for instance, had him on, however often it was, 2 or 3 times a year, and almost never had any other influential or informed MEP don't mean myself, but anybody else. So that is a handicap. But I think that when we have a government that has perhaps a less anti-European set of reflexes, it's possible that the BBC might reflect that. And also, the London Assembly is quite a good platform from which to approach the metropolitan press. And UKIP did quite well through that, not as well as Farage did in the European Parliament. But I don't see why we shouldn't, with opinion moving very clearly and continuing to move in our direction, why we shouldn't be able to mimic that over the next 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
I think that's totally right. One of the 25 members of the Assembly would be a very powerful position to have. And you only need one member on the Assembly, which only needs 5% of the vote on ballot 3 to actually start putting this forward. But I think one of the reasons, going back to that point about what we lack, and you're right, Tim, we do lack some of the things that would get us on the BBC. And the big thing we lack is weirdos. One of the reasons the BBC loved UKIP is because they could get every weirdo under the sun on there and basically think they were mocking them. Now, obviously, that did come back to bite because no one thought they would be very successful. So what I would say to, if there is any very weird pro-Rejoin people there, please let us know. We'd love to have you along. You can definitely get us more publicity.
We're rather disappointed in our current membership, aren't we, Richard? They're all disturbingly sane.
Try being strange, but we're just not strange enough to get onto the BBC.
I see. Okay, right. Well, let's see if we can find a few weirdos for you. But you both come across as extraordinarily sound. Brendan, maybe it's got something to do with your Jesuitical background.
Well, some people might regard that as a disqualification. I remember that I was in the European Parliament on one occasion, sitting at a committee meeting, and everybody was making a contribution, and somebody mentioned in passing that they'd been educated by the Jesuits, an Italian colleague. And then of the next 15 who spoke, 12 said that they also have been educated by the Jesuits, including myself. So perhaps it is a qualification to
it does have an impact. It does
to rise high in the European Parliament.
I was quite late in the game. I was only educated by Jesuits when I got to Oxford, and but
you were at Campion Hall, were you?
No, I was at St Benet's, but I was sent to Campion quite a lot, which is opposite Christchurch. Which
absolutely, which is where I was. Yeah,
yes. What did you read?
I classics, and I had some good friends there, and Tony Meredith. I don't know if you came across him.
I know Tony Meredith very well. Oh my goodness!
Well, how funny! Yes, no, he was a great chum in those days.
There we are. No, but it's I read theology. But of course, under the present government, there's even a debate about the sort of utility of particular subjects. Your subject would be out, my subject would be out, because these aren't valuable. And so I think it's so important in many ways that we have a greater link with Europe.
Well, I couldn't agree more, because I think that the argument about Brexit, obviously it has an economic component to it, and that's very important. But it also has a moral and a cultural component to it. That Brexit was brought about and is sustained by fantasy and illogic and lies. And I think that a political culture which is based on that must be one which is in grave peril. And it's certainly one that undermines and lessens the possibilities, intellectual and moral, of the voters, of the people who are in that political society.
Presumably, you can see why this particular government would like to reduce the ability for critical reasoning skills via university degrees. And it's not really surprising when you put it in that context.
And you'll know, Tim, from your experience in UKIP, that Erasmus was something that was a big trigger for them, because yes, it was people going and becoming more educated and more cultivated and having their minds open to the wider world. Yes, and that's something that they found rather difficult to cope with.
To see something different. But Farage certainly had his mind opened. He spent a lot of time in Brussels and seemed to enjoy it there. And
it's one of the things that Rich and I occasionally argue about, that I have a less dismissive view of Farage than Richard does. I think that within his lights, he stuck to what I do think he believed in. Now, they're not beliefs that I share, but he went about in a consequential and determined way, turning them into reality.
Well, I have to say I'm much more cynical on that particular point. He strikes me as an opportunist, to be quite frank, and I think what Tim was saying there probably backs up that particular point. And the one thing we do agree on, though, I think, Brendan, is that Nigel Farage is one of the worst human beings around at the moment in terms of the direction he's trying to lead this country in, and should always be opposed.
I mean, the direction I agree with. I think I'm sure your Jesuitical teachers would have told you to detest the sin, but not the sinner.
Yes, exactly. I've always tried to see the best in Mr. Farage. I think he's a remarkable orator. I think his range of oratory is slightly limited to one subject, but he's perfected that subject rather well. And now he's saying that he would rather stay on Twitter and then go back into politics. Politics is too difficult. So maybe he's leading the country down the back alley of social media, which but no, let's go back to Europe, because one of the problems I found with Europe, having lived there for a long time, was that it was becoming sort of top heavy and chaotic, and I felt that we could have made a much greater impact if had we in the European Parliament been a little bit more focused and a little less distracted by the Brexit issue. And that Brexit itself has catapulted Europe into becoming significantly more unified.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's so interesting to hear how toned down the rhetoric of the hard right politicians in Europe is now over the potential of leaving the European Union. And let's be honest, the UK's economy is a huge, significant economy, and people look at how badly we've floundered since leaving the European Union, not just because of leaving the European Union. And I would argue Brexit has two dimensions. Yes, there's the leaving of the European Union, but there's also the popular sway away from listening to experts and listening to the bloke down the pub. And we now have the worst politicians you could possibly wish for at the top of the helm in the UK, which of course is exacerbating the problems we have. And I think many people who would naturally be Eurosceptics within the EU look at that and think, I want to come across as anti-EU, but not quite that anti-EU. I don't want to be forced into that position.
One of the lessons I drew from the European Parliament was that the view of themselves that many British people have as being pragmatists is the opposite of the truth. Certainly as far as Europe's concerned, most British politicians and many British officials were driven by ideology, by fear of being taken over by the superstate. And they were so busy worrying about that they hadn't always got the time and bandwidth and intellectual capacity to be able to contribute what sometimes the British genuinely can contribute, which is a real pragmatism, a real willingness to compromise, a real willingness to see the other person's point of view. But that didn't really work within the European Union for the last 10 years for the British, because we were so busy agonizing about whether we should be there in the first place or not.
And no one seems to really thought about the process of Brexit.
Well, I can understand why people don't think about the process of Brexit that way. Madness lies. And I'm quite serious about that, because any attempt that you make to make sense of it immediately comes up against an alternative set of buffers. Are you going to harm yourself economically? Are you going to assert your sovereignty, your theoretical sovereignty? And it's like being bounced off the walls of insoluble dilemmas.
Well, there seem to be two problems. Number one is about how to effect Brexit, how to get Brexit done. And number two is the much more fundamental issue about whether or not you respect the referendum. So could we go back to respecting the referendum?
Why not? Let's talk about the 2011 referendum then. Let's talk about the referendum to keep first past the post, the one that the Reform Party is now trying to blatantly overturn, despite it having a 2/3 majority. Now, I actually agree with the Reform Party on that particular referendum because democracies change their mind. And so I guess the question that I would put to people, as most people think it's perfectly fine to overturn the 2011 referendum, why not the 2016 referendum, which was far closer anyway? And if there is some magic timeline, we're clearly within 5 years of it now. So when's the date?
Well, wouldn't we follow up by that by saying the 2011 referendum was fairly irrelevant and fairly limited?
It was a referendum. The British people voted on it. They voted quite clearly. And unlike the 2016 referendum, it was a binding referendum as well. And it had a majority of about 2/3. Now, most people now agree that first past the post is probably not the way we want, apart from the leadership of the Conservative Party and the leadership of the Labour Party. So it is a referendum. It's a referendum. We can't say, oh, that was an important referendum. That wasn't an important referendum.
But the referendum has been respected. We've left the European Union.
Absolutely.
We have.
It's completely discharged. It's a new world. And it's a very undemocratic belief that you can't revise an opinion or a decision that you made in the past.
Well,
that really is the Ermächtigungsgesetz. It really is the enabling law that once you got your majority, you can't go back on it. I find that extraordinary.
We go back on it in every other election, don't we?
Well, exactly. Yes, I mean, is the Labour Party, when it loses an election, supposed to say, oh, well, of course, we're not going to oppose the Conservative Party in government for 5 years because we've got to respect the result of the election. Democratic politics don't work that way.
So I would also just point out, just before we move on this point, that we have had 2 general elections since then. In both of those general elections, a majority of people voted for parties that were openly wanting to either stop Brexit or rejoin the EU on either of those occasions. And it's only the mechanics of the system, the first past the post system, that installed a majority Conservative government on a minority of the vote. So again, if you want evidence as to why the 2016 referendum should be revisited, we have 2 further votes in 2017 and 2019 that indicate that, as well as continuous opinion polling evidence.
Could we be hypothetical for a second? So let's imagine all 3 of us accept the referendum to leave the European Union. Do you think that there were serious mistakes made in the process of trying to effect Brexit?
Yes, and I will say yes here. I know a lot of people say, right, well, you're all in or you're all out, but there was a lot of other ways that we could have gone about Brexit. For example, nobody ever talked about leaving the EEA. We could have simply left the EU and gone into the EEA. Now, in actual fact, I think that would have given much more cover for the Brexiteers to, first of all, claim a victory and make that victory look like it was working. And quite frankly, the way that Brexit was gone about by the government elected in 2019 was sheer wanton vandalism, unnecessary vandalism. It's almost as if they were thinking, yeah, this is a mistake. Let's do it in the most damaging way possible so that people will want to go back into the EU straight away. And it has been incredibly damaging the way it's been gone about.
Wasn't already set up by Theresa May's efforts at the end of the previous administration?
Well, they were pretty much scrapped by Johnson in terms of the way he went forward afterwards.
I don't entirely agree with Richard there. We're a very pluralistic party, as you all have observed. I think that particularly the way the referendum was fought, the way in which Brexit was implemented over the next 6 or 7 years was inevitable. Because it was so much based on ideas of exceptionalism. We've just got to tell these people what we want. We'll just hang tough, and we mustn't make any concessions to them. No deal is better than a bad deal. All those things were central to the Brexit message. And I don't think it would have been possible for Theresa May or any prime minister to emancipate himself or herself from those pressures. The reason why she hesitated so long before triggering Article 50 was that she knew that she would be confronted immediately with irresoluble dilemmas, and you have only the choice of bad outcomes. I don't think there were any significantly better outcomes, particularly trying to remain in the single market or customs union when you'd said what we want to do is get rid of the constraints of being subject to European law, why on earth would you want then to subject yourself to that law with a diminished role in the adoption of that law? It would have made no political sense at all.
Oh, that's typical Brendan, wanting political common sense to come out of some negotiations. But yeah, you're right. We have this whole thing around sovereignty, and I don't know how people think we've got sovereignty now. We have an unelected prime minister who nobody even knew existed at the time of the 2019 election, and who was actually specifically rejected by his own party, who's just waltzed in, taken over all power. And now the cheek of it wants to get rid of the ECHR, the only limit on his unelected power at the moment. You really couldn't make it up.
Well, to be fair, he hasn't yet said that. He's allowed people to believe that that's what he's going to do, but he always leaves himself a bolt hole.
Even if he did say that, he would have to give a 6-month notice to leave the ECHR, which would take us into the election anyway.
Not necessarily.
Almost. Oh, we're just begging to get to the summer recess so we can't do any more damage.
There we are. Migration. Can I raise the sticky issue? Before I do that, I'd like to say something. If you were in Lord Frost's position, and assuming that you had, assuming, Brendan, for example, you were back in the Conservative Party, would you have negotiated better? Could you have got a better deal?
I think it's possible that at the margins, slightly less harm might have been done. But that's the very most that I would allow. It's a bit like if my mother had been a man, she'd have been my father. The thought of me being Lord Frost is one which I think both of us would find some intellectual difficulty in trying to internalize.
I certainly have made a serious mistake in terms of what room I'd walked into for that to be a realistic scenario. But yes.
Yeah. The serious point is there was perhaps a little damage limitation that could have been carried out, but not much, and it wouldn't have altered the fundamental problem of Brexit, which is that it's based on a pack of lies and fantasy.
And Chris Heaton-Harris's efforts to sort out Northern Ireland haven't really achieved a great deal. It's
always seemed to me that Northern Ireland, or the whole question of relations on the island of Ireland, as a result of British history, crystallised the dilemmas of Brexit on steroids. It made those difficulties between economics and politics and constitutional stability very, very clear. And there's no real answer to that either. It's quite an effective piece of sticking plaster that's been put over the wound. But I don't think it's a wound that's, as it were, ever going to heal until you have, and that's a little way down the road, a united Ireland.
Or indeed an independent Scotland.
That's another issue, of course, because there is an alternative pole of attraction in the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland, which it will be easier in some way, or considerably easier, for Northern Ireland to be integrated into than Scotland simply to become an independent nation on its own.
Could Scotland then become part of the European Union?
I don't think there'd be any problem. I think that a country which is outside the European Union, like the UK, doesn't have the same privileges within the European Union that member states do. People talk about Catalonia, for instance, as far as the Spanish are concerned, or the Basque Country. Well, the European Union is perfectly willing to support the position of the central Spanish government vis-a-vis the Basque Country and Catalonia. But it's up to individual countries outside the European Union to sort out their relationships among themselves. And it doesn't greatly bother the European Union if the British or the English rump state were discombobulated by the Scottish joining the European Union.
So if let's say you won a majority in Parliament, let's be optimistic, and
because no one would question the veracity of that poll.
and therefore immediately we telephoned Ursula von der Leyen and the high-ranking members of the European Commission and the European Parliament said we want to get back in, how long would it take?
Several years.
Would we not be behind Albania?
Oh no, but well, who knows where Albania would be at that stage?
Albania is in a wonderful position.
Certainly, the fact that we were for a long time members of the European Union would stand us in good stead. It would mean there would be less in the way of alignment to do. One of the unresolved questions of British politics over the next 5 years is how far the United Kingdom is going to drift into de-alignment with the rest of the European Union. The most recent report suggests that the de-alignment may be gathering pace, but it is another problem of Brexit that you're always going to be confronted with the choice between demonstrative sovereignty and economic rationality. And I don't think there's going to be any coherent approach to that from any government as long as we're outside the European Union.
Indeed, and I think even in the last 24 hours, we've heard updates on this, because obviously April the 30th is the day that all the new checks are supposed to be coming in that are going to add huge amounts to the costs coming in from the EU. We've delayed it, we've delayed it, we've delayed it. And now I'm hearing that there's a whisper that they might not even be enforced on April the 30th because the economic damage that's going to happen would be so great. So the chaos is just going to continue going on. Yes, we may slowly drift and diverge, but even in advance of an agreement to rejoin the EU, regulatory alignment can be something that's achieved relatively swiftly, if we want to.
Yeah, so the areas where we're likely to foul up, I presume, are areas in agriculture and getting medicines, the things which we're actually finding particularly difficult, and
the meat industry particularly,
well, absolutely, but so that the harder it becomes for us to survive on the terms we've got at the moment, the more we're likely to be doing deals with other nations and accepting poorer quality meat, poorer quality medicines.
Well, we'll be trying to avoid that. We'll be trying to avoid that. But I don't think that people who aspire to be in politics should simply sit there waiting for circumstances to come in their direction. And when it's so bad, we've got no alternative but to get back into the European Union. What we're trying to do is bring forward the date when we put an end to the problem, and the country suffers less thereby because we put an end to the problem or resolve it more quickly than might otherwise have been the case.
Absolutely. I mean, I accept that one of the necessary but not sufficient conditions is an unambiguous expression of public will that we want to head back to the EU. And that is certainly something that does have to happen in advance of whatever route that we take back into the EU. I mean, Brendan and I often have discussions on this, and I'm rather more optimistic as to how quickly it can be done. And I know Brendan thinks that some of the views I have on how we can rejoin quickly may turn out to be fantasy, but whatever. Any route you take has to start with an expression of public will. And that's why we're here, to try to get that expression of public will onto the agenda sooner rather than later. Because the sooner we start clearing up this mess, the sooner we end.
Except that leaving was so much easier than rejoining.
You didn't find it painful?
It took a long time. It took a long time, didn't it?
But the actual test, the actual process seemed quite simple to voters, whereas the process of rejoining seems quite complex. However you initiate that conversation, it's a complex process. And more than that, you're not the only people in the game. There's what about the True and Fair Party? Gina?
Well, the True and Fair Party are doing a wonderful job. Brendan and I both went to support them in one of their by-elections recently in Mid-Bedfordshire. There's no reason for us to stand where the True and Fair Party are standing. I think they're focusing their efforts on just a few constituencies.
I think they've only got 7. Why don't you join ranks?
Well, they have a different overlapping agenda. They're particularly interested in the reform of the House of Commons and political and administrative evolution. Our central interest is Yeah, there's Rejoin. Now,
Oh.
people call us a one issue party, but it's an issue with ramifications over the whole scope of British politics. Not to say that everything was ever going to be decided exclusively in Brussels. That's a hobgoblin. That's a nonsense. But it does have ramifications widely throughout British politics.
Yes,
I would also point out on that subject as well, Tim, that there are other parties in the game, like Volt UK, for example. And Volt UK have partnered with us very, very closely in London. And indeed, 3 of the Rejoin EU team on the list of 11 are Volt UK members. So we don't claim that we've got the monopoly on this particular debate. And we are very interested in working with other parties who are pro-EU, want to rejoin the EU, but have other issues as well. One of the reasons for Rejoin EU is because we literally have that one policy and one other principle. And our other principle is that we don't tolerate bigotry and intolerance. So anyone who wants to rejoin the EU and doesn't actively or passively promote bigotry and intolerance is welcome in our ranks. When you're looking at other parties like the Volt UK, such as True and Fair, such as other parties that we've worked with at various times, the European People's Party, they may have other policies that people don't feel they can get behind. That's why we are a broad church. But bottom line is, any party that is going to promote rejoining the EU is a party that we're interested in talking to.
How many people have you got standing in the general election?
It's a very good question. As it stands, we have around about 25 to 30 people who put themselves forward as being potential candidates. Depending on where we are by the time of the general election, and depending on what funds we've got at the time, that's when we'll make the decision how many people we're going to stand and where they're going to stand. What I would just emphasize, though, we've had a lot of individuals approaching us saying, I want to stand in the general election in my constituency because no other party speaks to me. I want to stand as a Rejoin EU candidate. Can I stand? And I'm afraid our answer to them is, yes, you can, as long as you've got the 500 quid. And that, of course, is where the big barrier comes in, people raising their deposits to actually stand. Our intention is to keep working to get a target of up to 100 people standing in the general election. But of course, whether all those 100 people will have their £500, when push comes to crunch, you are put in the public light. There's a lot of very nasty people on social media who can attack candidates, make it feel quite unpleasant. And I've had a lot of quite sad conversations with people, which include, well, I'd like to stand, but I'm a bit worried that with a foreign accent, I'd be a target for abuse. Another person saying, I'd like to stand, but my partner's European, and I don't want to cause any problems with him at work. And unfortunately, the right have succeeded with a lot of their intimidatory tactics in putting people off. All I can do is assure people that they'll have the full support from us at the centre if they want to put themselves forward, and encourage people to do so.
And what sort of central bureaucracy and backup do you have?
Well, we actually have our candidates and agents meeting at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Probably, unfortunately, that'll be after the video's gone out. But at the moment, what we're doing is every third Friday, we started in January with an open meeting for anyone who just wanted to lightly consider whether they might be prepared to be a candidate or whether they might be prepared to be an agent in the upcoming election. Today, we're having a sort of hybrid physical Zoom meeting of those who are still interested. We will keep the meeting semi-open, I should say, but basically anyone interested in potentially standing, third Friday in every month, we will have an update meeting up to the election in January 25, which is pretty much what I'm convinced it's going to be.
You think it's going to be so late?
I think it is. I know that we all disagree on this, but I can't see, why would you call an election if you were Sunak before that? If you called an election for January, you get one more Christmas in Downing Street showing off to the world, putting your feet up, doing nothing, and you get to make Christmas and New Year totally miserable for Labour Party activists. So from Sunak's point of view, I'm pretty sure that's a win-win.
But you also make it miserable for Conservative activists as well. And
I don't think Conservative activists are going to be too worried about what they do during this election. I think most of them will just put their feet up and enjoy Christmas.
What was your background before Rejoin, Richard?
Oh, you mean politically? I have been a bit of a gadfly. I did join the Labour Party back in the 90s as a student activist. I left the party during Tony Blair to join the Lib Dems in the early noughts. I then left the Lib Dems after Charles Kennedy to join the Greens. Then after the 2015 election, where the Greens were saying, let's have a referendum, what could go wrong? I left the Greens and went back to Labour. And then I left the Labour Party again when Keir Starmer was elected. So I like to say it's not me, it's you. I haven't changed my views. And I think anyone who could have stayed in the same political party for the last 25, 30 years has to be a little bit politically schizophrenic to be able to have done that.
As opposed to politically promiscuous.
Well,
well, I have stood for more political parties than I've had hot dinners.
Really?
Yes, not pro-Euro Conservative Party, the EPP I stood for.
Yes.
Yes to Europe. I deserve an entry in the Guinness Book of Records, I think, but I haven't got one yet.
It is very strange how the political system has sort of changed around us. And I've certainly noticed it, and you have as well.
I mean, how could you possibly be a fanatical Blair supporter and yet at the same time totally loyal to Corbyn and adore Miliband as the chosen son as well? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Logically, there is a disconnect between those.
Well, I think there is such a thing as party loyalty. I think that's something that is a genuine value. The Conservatives used to say it was their secret weapon. Well, they certainly haven't got it now, the way they kick lumps out of each other. But I think that Mrs. Thatcher actually changed the nature of the Conservative Party. She made it a party that didn't so much want to conserve things. She thought she had a recipe for improving radically the United Kingdom, and it wasn't a conservative recipe with a small c. And she also introduced this idea that there were people within the Conservative Party who weren't really conservatives. And I think that's a very toxic notion to get into particularly the Conservative Party. That's my point of view.
Yeah.
Sorry?
This is he one of us?
Exactly that. Exactly that.
So the Inquisitors have arrived.
Yes, for the Conservative Party, it was an essential building block. That of course everybody else who's a Conservative is one of ours, because we are a Conservative tribe.
Well, I certainly see a parallel in Labour with that at the moment. The number of voluntary or non-voluntary disillusioned former Labour activists there are is getting quite large now. It has to be said.
Yes, well, Owen Jones, of course, is on the list. But what I find so fascinating about the political climate, certainly since Mrs. Thatcher, is how there are so few great speakers in the Conservative Party, and how there have continued to be quite a number of great speakers in the Labour Party. But are there great speakers in the Rejoin Party? Well, Richard, you're doing very well.
I was going to say, I wish that we get on TV a little bit more, but and I think in actual fact, Tim, this does go back to Brexit. If you were a genuine political conservative back in 2016, even if you could bite your lip, hold your nose and get through the referendum on the basis of tolerating the lies and disinformation coming from your colleagues, most quality conservatives have slowly left the Conservative Party going out. So we've kind of really seen the race to the bottom within the Conservative Party as the dregs have been pulled up to ministerial office, climaxing, of course, with Liz Truss as Prime Minister. If you were to go back to 2014 and show someone that Liz Truss was going to be the Prime Minister of the UK, you wouldn't even have got that as a comedy show on BBC4 at the time, because it was just such a ludicrous thought. But this is the reason I think we've lost the quality, because now anyone with cognitive reasoning skills could not ultimately tolerate being part of this government.
Now, once you are successful, your membership is going to go back into the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, isn't it?
Might do.
Or do you have a future plan?
If we rejoin the EU, I'm down to the Electoral Commission with the winding up notice tomorrow. Absolutely. We have one aim to get Britain.
What happens to your members? What happens to your members who left the Labour Party or left the Conservative Party to join you, to tie their flags to you? What are you going to do with them? Are they going to be going cap in hand back to Liz Truss and say,
let's
have me back?
Let's explore this notion of membership, Tim. One of the things we've been very careful of is not to actually have official members of our party. So we have a mailing list of about 4,000 to 5,000 people, but the only people I think would be regarded as members, unambiguously, are myself, Brendan and Andrew, who are the three officers of the party. And that's for a very clear reason. Labour will expel you if you try to join another party. The Green Party, surprisingly enough, expelled my agent in Chester because he was a member of the Green Party, and just acting as my agent was enough to get him expelled there. So we very much encourage political pluralism. You can be a member of any of those three parties. You can even be a member of the Conservative Party if you want, and you can come along to our meetings. You can get involved in what we do. So, and indeed, we have even some of our committee members kind of anonymize themselves because they are still associated with other parties, and we are perfectly happy to encourage that. I think it's only myself, Brendan, and Andy who are completely unambiguously.
So I know that I know that Lee Anderson is very keen to point out, and as indeed is Farage and Richard Tice, that there are members of the present Conservative Party, present Conservative government, who are interested in going over to them. Do you have any? Do you have any members of Parliament who are interested in you?
Well, it depends what you mean by interested. I do have friends in Parliament, and we do occasionally have drinks. I don't think any of them would consider flipping over to our party. And indeed, it's a position I respect because there's a lot of genuine people within the Labour Party, within the Green Party, and particularly within the Lib Dems, who are fighting within their party to try to make their party have more sense. We're here for those people who say, you know what, I've had enough of this pretense. I just want a party that unambiguously stands for me. And those people who support us in the elections, if we do eventually go back to the EU, which I hope will be relatively soon, then what they choose to do with their political futures is entirely down to them. And indeed, I look fondly forward to a future when Brendan and I are back on the opposite side of debating chambers, debating each other on more minor issues than the future of the human race in Northern Europe.
Yet certainly, if we do get back into the European Union, the party political landscape would look so different from what it is today that it's rather difficult to predict who's going hand in cap to whom. But what I would say is that particularly in France, Spain as well, certainly in Italy, where there is a much more fluid party system, people are much less hung up about the idea, I used to be a Conservative, now I'm a Christian Democrat, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. So so if we rejoined Europe, the terms probably be that we surrender the pound and we possibly surrender first past the post.
Well, I'm not sure any of those things will be a surrender. Certainly not first past the post. And when you talk about surrendering the pound, I would prefer to think about joining the euro and joining Schengen rather than giving something up.
Absolutely.
You mentioned migration, by the way. The reason why migration is...
We wanted to talk about migration, and we got waylaid by so many more interesting things.
But I just wanted to make the point that because politicians have not made the case in favour of migration, it's always been presented as something that's a threat. It's become, in the mind of many, a threat. Whereas it's
becoming a threat to Europe as well.
Well, that's a slightly different question. For the United Kingdom, European migration, economic migration, was an undoubted benefit. It fitted very well with our model of a service economy, and now we're needing, as it were, to import labour, but it's coming not so much from continental Europe, not from the EU, but from far further afield. And these people coming perfectly legitimately from further afield are much more likely to spend the rest of their lives here, which is a culturally and economically quite different proposition from the Poles and the Romanians and the Hungarians, who on the whole, not without exception, who on the whole came here for a period of 5 or 6 years, contributed to the British economy, and then went back home. It's a completely different model of economic migration that we've got at the moment. And I think that the one we had before in the European Union was actually having our cake and eating it.
I entirely agree with you. But if you take the migration crisis, which has been going on since the turn of the century, the poorer countries in the south of Europe have really had it hard. Countries like Greece, where I lived for many years, it struggled with migration, and the rhetoric which was coming out of Greece. I remember marches of Christiaki round my house, and I also remember feeling quite intimidated by it. And we hear the same sort of rhetoric now in the UK, that migrants are bad, and that migrants are taking away our jobs, and I'm not quite sure how to change that dialogue, because that needs to be a subject that we deal with if we're going to rejoin Europe.
You're totally right, but the problem is no one is willing to have a rational debate about immigration and how it affects the UK. Let's just remind ourselves of some basic facts. Our reproductive rate in the UK has now fallen to 1.5, which basically means, left alone, for every 4 people we've got now, we'll have 3 in a generation's time. We are reliant on either immigration coming into the country in order to maintain the status quo, or the aging population. And we do have a huge aging population bubble that's now hitting retirement. We need younger, healthier individuals within the economy to economically support that particular bubble. And that's where immigration has to come in. And personally, I think rather than worry about, oh, my job's going to be taken, no, it's not. There's not enough people to adequately support the physical economy as it actually is. So whilst I totally accept what you say about an immigration crisis in the south of Europe, there isn't an immigration crisis in the UK. Nobody is being overwhelmed by huge numbers of immigrants coming.
But that's not the rhetoric that's going through. The rhetoric being pumped out is that it is a major crisis. Surely the answer is to have a global convention and re-look at the 1951 refugee convention.
That's why I'm a globalist, Tim, rather than a nationalist, because I do believe, I think it's amazing that a quarter of the way through the 21st century, we're still in these little national enclaves when our problems are global. We have an environmental crisis on a global scale. Our lives are run by global corporations, and yet we still focus on governance at the micro level. It's not surprising that we have this chaotic result. And so I think you're absolutely right there. It does need global solutions to this sort of problem, and thinking that we can just build the walls around our little island and be safe from the rest of the world is something that's not going to happen. Human beings for 500,000 years have been getting in small boats and moving to other places in the world. And suddenly, by putting up a flag saying I'm in UKIP, you're not going to stop it happening.
Yeah. No, I think we probably ought to stop there, because you've got to go on to greater things. But yes, Brendan, thank you very much, and Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending.
Thank you for having us on, Tim.
It's a real pleasure. And I think there are so many other things we could talk about, and maybe we could have another chat in a few months' time and see how you're getting on.
That would be amazing. Yes, love to do that. I have a feeling that over the summer, once we've got the data from all of these elections, I don't just mean the London election, I think all the local elections, we see whether a leadership challenge to Sunak has actually materialized, or if he's just going down with the Titanic at the end of the year. It's going to make some much more interesting follow-up topics to discuss.
Well, I wish you all the very best. And
thank you very much. Thank you.
Lovely to meet you.
Goodbye.